guess what? We've got another drug. It is synthetic, and it makes you love everybody.
The history of ecstasy begins in the early 20th century. Only through accident was it ever created by Manish and Jacobson, two German scientists working for Merck in 1912 as an intermediate to a vasoconstrictor known as hydrostatin. Ecstasy, the common name given to the drug methylene dioxymethylamphetamine, MDMA, was patented in 1912 by the German chemical company, supposedly to be sold as a diet pill. The company decided against marketing the drug and had nothing more to do with it.
Alexander Shulgin is the man responsible for the modern research of MDMA. After graduating from the University of California at Berkeley with a PhD in biochemistry, Shulgin is also the first reported human to ever use MDMA. Because MDMA was already patented in 1913, it held no profit potential for drug companies. A drug cannot be patented twice. The only way to repossess that expense is by obtaining limited rights to sell the drug through holding its patent. Only a few experimental therapists researched and tested the drug between 1977 and 1985. The most well-known desirable effect of ecstasy is how it breaks down the walls of communication by letting go feelings of guilt, remorse, and fear. MDMA was first used by therapists to treat depression and anxiety associated with trauma, such as rape. It is now being tested for value in patients with post-traumatic stress disorder and depression or anxiety in patients who are terminally ill. It has also been shown to dramatically reduce tremors in those with Parkinson's disease.
In the early 1980s, MDMA began to be used non-medically, particularly in Texas under the name ecstasy. In 1987, the rave culture began to pick up on the small Spanish island Ibiza. Within 4 years, this drug had gone full circle and found its way back home. In 1985, it was reported that this drug received immense media attention when a group of people sued the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, to try to avoid them from outlawing the drug, placing it on Schedule 1. Drugs, substances, and certain chemicals used to make drugs are classified into 5 distinct categories or schedules, depending upon the drug's acceptable medical use and the drug's abuse or dependency potential. Schedule 1 drugs are considered the most dangerous class of drugs with a high potential for abuse and potentially severe psychological and physical dependence. As the drug schedule changes, Schedule 2, Schedule 3, and so on, so does the abuse potential. Schedule 5 drugs represent the least potential for abuse. The U.S. Congress had passed a new law allowing the DEA to put an emergency ban on any drug that it thought might be a danger to the public. On July 1, 1985, this right was used for the first time to ban ecstasy. A hearing was held to decide what permanent measures should be taken against the drug. One side argued that MDMA caused brain damage in rats. The other side claimed this might not be true for humans and that there was proof of the valuable use of MDMA as a drug treatment in psychotherapy. The judge, after weighing the evidence, recommended that MDMA be placed on Schedule 3, which would have allowed it to be manufactured, used on prescription, and subject to further research. However, the DEA decided to place MDMA permanently on Schedule 1.
In 1965, the Drug Abuse Control Amendments were passed, referring to some drugs such as LSD. They thought that they were dangerous and allowed for the FDA to recommend them to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in order to control them and other drugs that may later have been deemed as an issue. This is the first direct prohibition of a drug decreed by the federal government.
In In 1969, President Richard Nixon announced that the Attorney General John N. Mitchell was preparing a complete new measure to more successfully meet the narcotic and dangerous drug problems at the federal level by combining all existing federal laws into a single new law. The CSA not only combined existing federal drug laws, but it also altered the nature of federal drug law policies and extended the span of federal drug laws and lengthened federal law enforcement as pertaining to controlled substances. In 1970, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, otherwise known as the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, was passed. It specifically stated that drugs under Act were now under federal jurisdiction and dealt with both narcotics and other dangerous drugs. The Attorney General was now in charge of enforcement, but health, education, and welfare through the FDA was in charge of defining what needed to be controlled. The CSA is the federal U.S. drug policy under which the manufacture, importation, possession, use, and distribution of certain substances is regulated. The Act also served as the national implementing legislation for the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. By 1986, the Drug Analog and Anti-Drug Abuse Acts had been passed. The Drug Analog Act was enacted to deal with designer drugs, allowing immediate classification of a substance as a controlled substance. Previous to this, people were avoiding prosecution with chemically tainted versions of controlled substances with related drug effects because they didn't appear on the schedules. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act focused on penalties for trafficking.
Detective Christopher S. Collery. Today is, I believe, January 15th, 2014.
What are the rights and responsibilities, in your opinion, of law enforcement and the DEA when it comes to drugs like ecstasy?
We go by state statutes, state laws, so it's going to be the Drug Act, Title 35 is where we get our authority.
And what do you feel is your responsibility?
My responsibility as a detective and as being assigned to the Cumberland County Drug Task Force is to enforce the drug laws of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Ecstasy, we see a lot of issues with it. So it is a serious drug that there's certainly consequences and serious issues with it. I think it is taken a little too lightly at times by users. They think it's a harmless drug, and it certainly is not. I've seen a lot of lives ruined by drugs. I've seen a lot of users who thought it was harmless ruin their lives, put themselves in situations, and their families. I've seen a lot of people die. We've had more deaths from drug use this year than we have probably the past 3 or 4 years combined. So, and none of those people intended to die. They just thought that this was a recreational thing they would do. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time, or it was a habit. But nonetheless, they paid the consequences for it, unfortunately. We've also seen a record high number of overdoses as well. Now, a lot of those people, all that's heroin, but a lot of those heroin users will tell you they started out with pills, oxy pills, or they may have started out with ecstasy, things like that, and they move on to something that's more affordable and more available. Under that title, under the Pennsylvania Crimes Code, is where we get our authority to enforce the drug laws, basically.
And what do you feel is your responsibility?
My responsibility as a detective and as being assigned to the Cumberland County Drug Task Force is to enforce the drug laws of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Ecstasy, we see a lot of issues with it. So it is a serious drug that there's certainly consequences and serious issues with it. I think it is taken a little too lightly at times by users. They think it's a harmless drug, and it certainly is not. I've seen a lot of lives ruined by drugs. I've seen a lot of users who thought it was harmless ruin their lives, put themselves in situations, and their families. I've seen a lot of people die. We've had more deaths from drug use this year than we have probably the past 3 or 4 years combined. So, and none of those people intended to die. They just thought that this was a recreational thing they would do. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time, or it was a habit. But nonetheless, they paid consequences for it.